The man who now tends our parish rose garden with such loving care, whose weathered hands, now gnarled but gentle, coax such vibrant life from the earth, whose quiet devotion is evident in every perfectly pruned blossom, is the same man who, not so long ago, stood over me, poised to end my life with a length of steel pipe. It is a profound mystery, this transformation, a living testament blooming beside our church's ancient walls, fragrant with the very grace it once so vehemently denied. Arthur Vance, the careful gardener, the man who cultivates beauty where once he sowed only despair, is forever linked in my memory to that chilling Sunday. I remember the moment not as a blur, not as a hazy nightmare that fades with the morning light, but with the horrifying clarity of a flash photograph seared into my soul. Every detail, every microsecond is etched there, immutable and terrifying, yet now also touched by a quiet, reverent awe at the path that followed. It was Sunday Mass, the heart of our week, the 11th hour of a seemingly ordinary morning. The air in St. Jude's was thick with the sweet ancient scent of incense, clinging gently to the very fabric of the old church, and the hushed reverence of 100 souls gathered in prayer. Sunlight, a divine painter, streamed through the magnificent stained glass windows, casting its holy light upon us, painting the nave in glorious, shifting hues of sapphire and ruby, emerald and gold. Each color seemed to hum with silent prayer, bathing the space in a warmth that belied the faint, persistent draft that always seemed to find its way through the old stone walls. There was a palpable sense of peace, a fragile sanctuary from the world's clamor, a collective breath held in spiritual anticipation. We had reached the consecration, the most sacred, the most profound moment of the Mass, when heaven itself seems to descend to touch our humble earth. My hands, trembling slightly not from infirmity, but with the sheer weight of the divine presence I felt gathering around the altar, held the host aloft. "Take this, all of you, and eat of it, for this is my body, which will be given up for you." The ancient words, spoken countless times over decades of priestly service, resonated in my chest with fresh, startling meaning that morning. Each syllable a prayer, a surrender, a profound act of faith. I felt deeply connected to a lineage of priests stretching back to the Last Supper itself, a conduit for an eternal mystery. The bells had just rung, a delicate silver chime piercing the profound silence, signaling the transubstantiation, the miraculous transformation. It was a sound that usually brought comfort, a sonic benediction. Then, a movement, a disruption. It began subtly, a flicker at the periphery of my vision, an anomaly that struggled to register against the backdrop of my total spiritual immersion. From the corner of my eye, a shadow detached itself from the side aisle, moving with an unnatural predatory swiftness that instantly felt profoundly out of place, an ugly discord in the sacred harmony. My peripheral vision registered only a dark, looming shape, too fast, too aggressive for the sanctity of the moment, for the hallowed space where prayers were whispered and souls found solace. My mind, still immersed in the mystery of the Eucharist, still echoing with the sacred words, struggled desperately to process what I was seeing. What was this? A medical emergency? A lost child straying from a parent? No. This was something else, something cold and utterly profane. An intruder not just to the church, but to the very soul of the Mass. He was on the sanctuary steps before anyone in the paralyzed congregation could react. A gaunt man I had never seen before in our small parish. His face a mask of contorted fury that twisted his features into something unrecognizable, inhuman. His eyes, fixed on me with terrifying intensity, burned with a pure, desolate rage, a fire I had never witnessed in a human being. It was not mere anger, not frustration, not even a passionate resentment. No, this was pure, unadulterated hatred, cold and absolute. And it was meant for me. It was meant for everything I stood for, every vow I had taken, every sacrifice I had made in service to God. It was an assault on my very identity, my very purpose. And then, the weapon. A length of dull gray steel pipe, thick and heavy, held aloft like some primitive, brutal club. It seemed impossibly large, impossibly out of place in this house of peace. The overhead lights from the sanctuary, which moments before had illuminated the sacred vessels, now glinted off its surface, a sickening flash that sliced through the sacred calm, a metallic shimmer of malicious intent. My heart lurched, a physical spasm of dread, but still, I held the host, my fingers tightening instinctively around its fragile form. The gasp started as a ripple, a scattered intake of breath from a few parishioners closest to the front, then erupted into a collective roar of terror from the congregation. A sound I will never forget. It was a chorus of disbelief and fear that tore the silence of God's house to shreds, replacing hushed prayers with guttural cries, scattering the serene beauty of the moment. I could feel their fear, a wave of palpable anguish washing over me even as I faced the attacker. He swung, He swung the pipe with a practiced, brutal efficiency, a sickening grace that left no doubt about his intent. It wasn't a wild, desperate flail of an untrained hand. It was a precise, targeted blow, aimed directly at my head, at the chalice on the altar, at the very essence of the body of Christ I held in my outstretched hands. It was a singular act of blasphemy and violence meant to shatter everything my life stood for, everything I believed, everything I had dedicated myself to since my ordination. Time, for me, ceased to exist, or rather, it stretched, became elastic, each nanosecond unfolding with excruciating slowness, a series of frozen, horrifying tableaux. I saw the dull gray pipe arcing towards me, a slow-motion trajectory of destruction. I saw the pure, undiluted hatred in his eyes, a depth of brokenness that chilled me to my core. I saw the horrified faces of my parishioners, frozen in a tableau of disbelief and terror, their mouths open in silent screams. 100 voices screamed, though I heard them only as a distant echo now, as if through water. In that endless moment, a desperate prayer formed in my heart, a raw plea for protection, not for myself, but for the sacred mystery I held. I did not have time to duck. I did not have time to pray with words, only with the entirety of my being. My instincts, honed by years of simple service, screamed, but my body moved too late. The host was still elevated, suspended between heaven and earth. Between my fingers, a beacon of grace in the face of such raw, earthly malevolence. I remember the impossible thought that flashed through my mind, clear and undeniable amidst the chaos. He cannot touch the body of Christ. It was a conviction stronger than any fear. I tried to shield it, to turn, to interpose my own failing body, to absorb the blow myself, to protect the sacred above all else. The impact was a shockwave, not just physical, though that was immediate and devastating, but spiritual, a deep wounding of the soul. It slammed into my arm and side with bone-shattering force. A crack, loud and sickening, echoed in the sudden, terrified silence of the church, a sound that seemed to reverberate through the very foundations of the sanctuary. Pain, raw and absolute, exploded through my nervous system. A white-hot spear driven through my flesh, consuming all other sensation. It was a fire, not of rage, but of pure, annihilating agony. My arm buckled, a grotesque betrayal of my will. The host, the sacred host, tumbled from my grasp, falling towards the marble sanctuary steps, a moment of such profound spiritual anguish that it overshadowed even the physical torment. My vision blurred. The vibrant colors of the stained glass spun into a kaleidoscope of chaotic light. A dizzying maelstrom of ruby and sapphire. My knees gave way, and I crumpled, the hard, cold stone steps rushing up to meet me. A final, unyielding embrace. The world tilted precariously. The screams intensified, closer now, piercing the haze of pain. Someone shrieked my name. "Father Michael!" The sound a desperate plea. As my head hit the cold marble with a dull thud, a profound and terrible question bloomed in the fading light of my consciousness. A thought that transcended the agony and the terror. It wasn't about fear. It wasn't about the excruciating pain that threatened to consume me, to drag me into oblivion. It wasn't even about the man towering over me, pipe still clutched in his hand, his eyes still burning with that devastating fire. No. My last conscious thought, before the darkness swallowed me whole, before the world went utterly silent, was this. Why, Lord, was this man's heart so broken? I still ask myself that question today, every single day. But the answer, when it finally revealed itself, was more impossible, more miraculous than the violence that brought me to my knees. It was an answer woven from the scent of roses and the unyielding power of divine love. The first thing I registered was not pain, but a vast, echoing silence. It was a silence that felt heavier, more profound than any I had ever known, broken only by a rhythmic, insistent beep, beep, beep that seemed to pulse in time with my own slow, struggling heartbeat. Then came the white, a blinding antiseptic white that permeated everything, from the sheets that swaddled me to the harsh fluorescent glow overhead. The scent was next, a clean chemical tang of disinfectant, utterly devoid of the frankincense and beeswax that usually filled my senses. I tried to move, to turn my head, but a dull, insistent throb blossomed behind my eyes and flared violently along my left arm and side, pulling a soft gasp from my dry, parched throat. It took a moment, a disoriented eternity, for the fog to lift, for the fragments of memory to coalesce into a terrifying whole. The sacred space of the altar, the hushed reverence of the consecration, the glint of steel, the terrible, desolate rage in a stranger's eyes, the impact, the cold marble, the profound question that had been my final conscious thought. Why, Lord, was this man's heart so broken? The question, I realized with a fresh pang, was still unanswered, still echoing in the sterile chamber of my awakening. I was in St. Joseph's Hospital, of course, the venerable, slightly aging institution that served our little town. I knew its hallways, its nurses, its quiet, tireless Sisters of Mercy, as well as I knew my own rectory. Yet this time I was on the other side of the white curtain, a patient, a recipient of care rather than its dispenser. My left arm was a heavy, immobile weight, swathed in bandages and resting awkwardly on a pillow. My side, too, felt encased, tight with dressings and the tender, bruising ache of deep impact. A small intravenous drip snaked into my other hand, a silent messenger of healing. A soft rustle drew my eyes to the corner of the room, a shadowy space just beyond the reach of the stark overhead light. It was a grouping of vases overflowing with flowers, lilies, carnations, and of course the ubiquitous roses that always found their way into a Catholic hospital room. Their fragrance, faint but persistent, cut through the antiseptic, a small vibrant rebellion against the sterile order. Next to them, a stack of cards, small, colorful testaments to care and concern. And then I heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible murmur like the distant hum of bees around a blossoming hive. It was the prayers. Even before the nurses told me, before Chief Dave walked in, I knew. My flock, my dear, faithful parishioners. They were there just beyond the closed door, a silent, persistent vigil. Their whispered rosaries, their petitions to St. Jude, their quiet acts of love and solidarity were a palpable presence, a spiritual force that wrapped around my hospital room, insulating it from the lingering chill of violence. I imagined Mrs. Henderson, her spectacles perched on her nose, clutching her well-worn beads. I pictured young Michael, who usually fidgeted through homilies, perhaps now kneeling, his head bowed, prompted by his worried mother. Mr. Rodriguez, the sternest usher, his face etched with concern. It was a strange, humbling thought, to be the object of so much solicitude, to feel the collective heartbeat of my community outside my temporary sanctuary. In a world that often felt fractured and cynical, this unwavering devotion was a beacon, a living testament to the very faith that Arthur Vance had so violently rejected. It was a reminder that even in the face of such profound brokenness, the thread of human connection, woven with divine love, remained strong, resilient, and a renewed surge of that initial question coursed through me. If such love could mend the wounds of the community, could it not somehow mend the terrible chasm in that man's heart? A gentle hand touched my uninjured arm, pulling me back from my reverie. Father Michael, you're awake. Thank God. It was Nurse Angela, a kind woman whose children I had baptized. Her eyes, usually sparkling with good humor, were weary, rimmed with dark circles. You gave us quite a scare, Father. Rest now. Don't try to talk. But I had to. I needed to know. How long? My voice was a rasp, a mere whisper. Just over 24 hours, she said, her voice soft and reassuring. You've been through a lot. The doctors say you're going to be fine, but it'll be a little while. She adjusted my pillow, her touch gentle and professional. The chief's been waiting patiently, Father. He insisted he'd only speak to you when you were lucid. Chief Dave arrived moments later, after Angela had checked my vitals and offered me a sip of water. He was a man of quiet competence, a pillar of our small town's law enforcement for decades. His face, usually a study in calm authority, was etched with a mixture of concern and a kind of quiet fury. He pulled a chair close to my bedside, his movements deliberate, his eyes scanning me with a paternal solicitude that belied his profession. Father Michael, he began, his voice low and steady. Thank God you're awake. We've all been praying for you. He cleared his throat, then ran a hand over his close-cropped gray hair. It's been a difficult 24 hours for everyone. The man, I managed, the word a struggle against the dryness in my throat and the lingering pain. Who was he? Dave nodded slowly, his gaze thoughtful. His name is Arthur Vance, Father. Arthur Wallace Vance. He's a professor, or was anyway, at the local college. Philosophy department. The name, Arthur Vance, hung in the sterile air, heavy with implication. A professor, a man of intellect, of reason. This immediately challenged my initial fleeting assumption of simple madness. The rage I had seen wasn't an unthinking animalistic outburst. It had been focused, intense, almost surgical in its intent. He's been uncooperative, to say the least, Dave continued, a hint of frustration in his tone. Refuses to speak with an attorney, just sits there, glowering. But we've pieced some things together. His neighbors, some of his former colleagues, they've filled in the blanks. Dave paused, looking at me, gauging my readiness for the difficult truth. You asked why, Father. I think we have an answer. Not an excuse, mind you, but an answer. He then told me the story of Arthur Vance, and as the details unfolded, I felt a fresh wave of sorrow. Not for myself, but for this broken man. Arthur Vance, Dave explained, had been married to a woman named Elena Vance. The name resonated. She had been a parishioner, Dave revealed, a quiet, devout woman. A daily communicant, Father, he said, emphasizing the phrase, knowing its significance to me. Never missed a mass. Not for years until. The word hung in the air, thick with unspoken tragedy. Until about a year ago, Dave continued, his voice softening. Elena died. Suddenly. A brain aneurysm. No warning, just gone. 1 minute she was there. The next, he trailed off, the brutal finality of it needing no further elaboration. A brain aneurysm, a sudden merciless thief in the night, stealing a life, shattering another. And Elena, a daily communicant. My mind raced, trying to place her face, her presence in the pews. Was she the woman with the gentle smile who always sat in the third row, left side? The one who occasionally brought me freshly baked bread after morning mass? The details were hazy, a testament to the sheer volume of souls I had ministered to over the years. But the essence of her devotion was clear. Arthur Vance, Father, Dave went on, his voice now lower, more somber. He was different, a very prominent, very vocal atheist. Used to write articles for obscure journals, debates at the college. Bragged about never setting foot in a church, even for holidays. Said it was all superstitious nonsense. But Elena, she was the anchor for him, I think. The quiet counterpoint to his intellectual bluster. Dave shifted in his chair, leaning forward slightly, his eyes fixed on mine. After Elena died, something snapped in him. He didn't just mourn. He raged. Not at her doctors, not at fate, not even at himself. He raged at God, at the church, at anyone who found solace in faith. He blamed you, Father, all of us who serve him. The pieces clicked into place, forming a mosaic of profound, agonizing grief twisted into something monstrous. The cold, desolate rage I had seen in his eyes, the absolute conviction behind his swing, it wasn't random. It was targeted. It was a cry of profound spiritual anguish, directed at the very heart of what he perceived as the enemy. He wasn't insane, Father, Dave reiterated, anticipating my unspoken question. Not in the clinical sense that would put him in a mental institution. He knew exactly what he was doing. He articulated it, even to the arresting officers. He was consumed by a cold, intellectual fury, a deep-seated philosophical anger that had finally boiled over. He saw you, he saw the Mass, as the embodiment of everything he hated, everything he believed had taken his wife and offered no comfort in return. A philosophy professor, an atheist blaming God for his wife's death. The irony was almost unbearable. He had denied God's existence, yet he held him responsible for his deepest pain. It spoke not of a lack of belief, but of a belief so profoundly inverted, so terribly wounded, that it manifested as a burning hatred. His atheism wasn't disinterest, it was an active, furious rejection born from an unaddressed spiritual wound. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the weight of this information settle upon me. The sheer, desolate loneliness of Arthur Vance's grief. To lose the person who grounded him, who quietly balanced his intellectual world with spiritual truth, and then to turn that void into a weapon against the very source of comfort. It was a tragedy within a tragedy. My initial question, why, Lord, was this man's heart so broken, now had a clearer, if no less painful, answer. It was broken by a grief so immense, so unyielding, that it had devoured his reason, twisted his intellect, and blinded him to all but his own raw, unchanneled pain. He hadn't sought understanding. He had sought retribution against a God he intellectually denied, but emotionally blamed. And in that moment, lying in that sterile hospital room, a patient instead of a priest, I felt a surge of something unexpected. Not fear, not even lingering pain, but a profound, aching compassion for Arthur Vance. The desire for justice, for punishment, simply wasn't there. Instead, an urgent, undeniable need to reach him, to penetrate the fortress of his grief and rage, began to take root in my heart. If his heart was so broken that it lashed out in such a violent, sacrilegious manner, then it was precisely his heart that needed mending. And who was I, a priest of Christ, to deny him the offer of healing, no matter how great the wound he had inflicted upon me? Dave, perhaps sensing the shift in my mood, looked at me with a questioning gaze. Father, are you all right? You look like you're carrying the weight of the world. I opened my eyes and met his gaze. I'm fine, Dave. Just processing. Thank you for telling me. It explains so much. And indeed it did. It explained the targeted ferocity, the blasphemous timing. It explained a desperate man's cry for an answer, a terrible misdirection of his anguish. It transformed the assailant from a faceless monster into a soul in torment. And the church, the body of Christ, was called to minister to souls in torment regardless of the sin they had committed, even against her own. My healing, I realized, would have to extend far beyond the bandages on my arm. It would have to encompass Arthur Vance, too. The seeds of an impossible reconciliation, a profound spiritual journey, were sown in that quiet hospital room, watered by the tears of a broken man I had yet to truly meet, and nurtured by the unwavering prayers of a faithful community. The miracle, I understood, would not just be for me, but for him. The days that followed my release from the hospital were a curious blend of physical recovery and profound spiritual introspection. My body, though bruised and scarred, mended with remarkable speed, a testament to the resilient youth I still, by God's grace, possessed. But the healing of my spirit, the recalibration of my pastoral compass, required far more than rest and antiseptic. Dave's words had etched themselves into my consciousness, transforming the phantom pain in my arm into an ache in my soul. Arthur Vance, an atheist consumed by grief, had blamed God, the church, and all of us who served him for his wife Elena's death. The face of a faceless assailant had been revealed, not as a monster, but as a man shattered by loss. I felt an inexplicable, undeniable pull. It was not towards justice, though the law would take its course. It was not towards self-pity, though the vulnerability of the altar had left its mark. No, it was a yearning, a deep, persistent calling to understand the genesis of such profound rage, the anatomy of a grief so vast it could justify an act of such audacious violence. Against the earnest, well-meaning advice of the diocese, which urged caution and distance, and against the professional counsel of Dave, who reminded me of the man's continued volatility, I knew what I had to do. My flock needed healing, yes, but so too, I suspected, did the man who had wounded their shepherd. My very priesthood demanded it. One crisp autumn afternoon, when the leaves had turned to fiery golds and passionate reds, painting our quiet town with a fleeting, beautiful melancholy, I drove towards the address Dave had given me. It was a street I knew well, lined with mature oaks and modest, well-kept homes, many of which belonged to my parishioners. The Vance residence, however, stood out, not through neglect exactly, but through a certain stillness, an air of suspended animation that distinguished it from its vibrant, living neighbors. The porch light was off, though dusk was gathering. The lawn, while not overgrown, lacked the manicured crispness of its fellows. It was a house holding its breath, waiting for a life that would never return. I had arranged with Dave to be given temporary access. The police, having concluded their initial search, had secured the property but left the key with a designated officer. As I approached the front door, the silence of the street pressed in, amplifying the faint creak of the porch swing that swayed gently in the autumn breeze. A wave of apprehension, cold and sharp, washed over me. This was the home of the man who had tried to end my life, a sanctuary of the very despair that had fueled his attack. Yet, beneath the apprehension, there was an abiding sense of purpose, a spiritual conviction that I was precisely where I needed to be. This was not morbid curiosity. It was pastoral responsibility, however unorthodox. The lock turned with a soft metallic click, an almost apologetic sound in the stillness. I pushed the door open, stepping across the threshold, and the air that greeted me was cool, still, and heavy with the scent of absence. It was the scent of dust motes dancing in the last shafts of sunlight, of faded potpourri, and of old books. More than that, it was the palpable scent of sorrow, a lingering echo of a life suddenly and violently interrupted. The police, true to their meticulous nature, had left the house in a state of clinical order after their search. Everything was in its place, yet nothing felt right. It was as if the contents of a heart had been meticulously catalogued and then left, undisturbed, to slowly calcify in a tomb of memory. The living room, bathed in the fading light, held an elegant if somewhat formal charm. A grand piano stood silent in one corner, its polished surface reflecting the window panes like dark pools. A half-finished knitting project, a delicate shawl in hues of lavender and cream, lay draped over the arm of a velvet armchair, needles still inserted, a ball of yarn nestled in a woven basket beside it. My gaze lingered on it, picturing Elena, perhaps, humming a tune as her fingers worked the intricate pattern, utterly unaware of the abrupt curtain call awaiting her. Her presence, Dave had said, was everywhere. And indeed, it was. In the kitchen, the ceramic mugs hung neatly on their hooks. A half-empty spice rack suggested a meal interrupted, not abandoned. A small, carefully tended herb garden on the windowsill, now mostly withered, spoke of someone who found joy in nurture, in growth. These were not the hallmarks of a chaotic home, but of a life lived with quiet grace, a life that had suddenly, inexplicably ceased. Each object felt like a whisper from the departed, a silent accusation against the injustice of time. I moved slowly, deliberately, through the rooms, a spiritual archaeologist sifting through the layers of a life abruptly ended. There were framed photographs too. A younger Arthur, smiling, his arm around a radiant Elena, her eyes sparkling with an infectious joy. Another of them hiking in the mountains, their faces flushed with exertion and happiness. The man in those photographs bore little resemblance to the gaunt, hate-filled figure who had attacked me. This was a man capable of love, of joy, of connection. This was a man who had lost everything. Upstairs I found the bedroom. It was a sanctuary within a sanctuary, a room that spoke most intimately of Elena. On her nightstand beside a reading lamp lay a well-worn Bible. Its pages were dog-eared, marked with countless annotations and underlines. I gently picked it up, feeling the smooth, cool leather beneath my fingers. A faded ribbon marked a passage in Job. The Lord gave and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Job 1:21. Elena, it seemed, had wrestled with faith too, but had found solace and acceptance in its challenging embrace. The contrast with Arthur's eventual reaction was stark, painful. I imagined her, sitting up in bed, perhaps reading these very words, finding comfort in their profound ancient wisdom. And then I imagined Arthur, waking up beside her, the day after her death, the reality of her absence a gaping wound. How could he have seen that Bible, felt its presence, and not been consumed by the very questions it sought to answer? Or perhaps he had seen it, and it was that very comfort she found, that very faith, that became the target of his intellectual fury. My exploration eventually led me to Arthur's study, a room distinctly different from the rest of the house. Here the sorrow was not suspended. It was actively, angrily expressed. The air was thicker, heavier, with the scent of old paper and stale coffee. Stacks of books, many with titles like The God Delusion, Why There Is No God, and treatises on existential nihilism, covered every surface. They were his armor, his fortress against the unbearable fragility of life. This was his intellectual battleground, where he waged war against the very concept of a divine hand. His desk, a large mahogany piece scarred with the marks of long use, was particularly telling. It was a landscape of intellectual warfare. Half-written articles, their arguments meticulously crafted to dismantle religious belief, lay scattered amongst printouts of scientific papers. And there, almost hidden, buried beneath a stack of dense philosophical texts, nestled beside a well-used thesaurus and a half-empty coffee mug, I saw it. It was a simple wooden rosary. The beads were smooth, worn, polished by countless prayers. The crucifix, made of equally humble wood, was unadorned, save for the faint imprint of a hand that had held it often, deeply. It was not a grand, ornate piece, but one of quiet devotion, almost certainly Elena's. My heart caught in my throat. This object, a symbol of profound faith, of gentle supplication to the Mother of God, lay hidden amidst the fierce intellectual weaponry of a man who vehemently denied her son. It was a relic of a love he had lost, a faith he had rejected, a silent witness to a battle raging within him. I picked it up, the cool wood of the beads a strange comfort against my fingertips. It felt charged, not with electricity, but with unspoken prayers, with unvoiced hopes. I imagined Elena holding it, her lips moving in silent petition. And then I saw Arthur, perhaps after her death, finding it, burying it, not to destroy it, but perhaps because its very presence was too painful, too great a reminder of a faith that, in his eyes, had failed to protect the woman he loved. Or perhaps, in a moment of raw, unreasoning grief, he had sought it out, not to pray, but to lash out at the silent wooden beads, only to recoil from the sacrilege. Leaving the house, the rosary clutched in my hand, I felt a new layer of understanding settle over me. Arthur Vance was not merely an atheist, he was a grieving man who had declared war on God. His atheism was not a calm, philosophical position, but a raging, desperate cry of a soul in torment. This was confirmed by the snippets of conversation I had with his neighbors in the following days. A kind, elderly woman named Mrs. Peterson, and a taciturn but observant retired carpenter, Mr. Henderson. They spoke of his transformation after Elena's death, with a quiet sadness that mirrored my own. He was always a bit quiet, Mrs. Peterson offered over a cup of tea, her eyes moist behind thick spectacles. Kept to himself, you know. But he loved Elena fiercely. You could see it. They were inseparable even with all his book learning and her church going. She paused, stirring her tea. After she passed, it was like a light went out in him. Not just dim, Father, but extinguished. He became a ghost in his own house. Mr. Henderson, usually a man of few words, nodded grimly when I spoke with him across his picket fence. Used to see him out walking with her every evening, rain or shine. After, he'd just stay inside. Sometimes, late at night, you'd hear him yelling. Not at anyone in particular, just yelling. At the sky, maybe. He then offered a detail that struck me deeply. Used to complain about your church bells, Father. Said they were an affront to reason. After Elena, he started tearing down your parish bake sale flyers from the community board. Not just taking them down, mind you, but tearing them. Like they personally offended him. It was then, hearing these accounts, that the full terrible picture clicked into place. Arthur Vance was not merely arguing against a god, he was arguing with him. His fury, his blasphemy, his very acts of destruction were, in a twisted, broken way, a form of prayer, a desperate, angry lament, mirroring the Job who cursed the day he was born, the Jeremiah who cried out against the silence of the heavens. He was a man drowning in an argument with a God he claimed not to believe in, his intellect a shield against a grief too profound to bear, his rage a desperate attempt to fill the void left by love. My initial question, posed in the horrifying clarity of the attack, why, Lord, was this man's heart so broken, began to find its answer. His heart was broken not just by loss, but by an inability to reconcile that loss with any meaning, any hope. He had sought reason, logic, and found only the cold, unyielding silence of the void. And so he lashed out, not at an indifferent universe, but at the very source of faith and hope that his wife had embraced, and that he himself, perhaps, had once secretly yearned for. The seeds of an impossible reconciliation, a profound spiritual journey, were indeed sown in that quiet hospital room, watered by the tears of a broken man I had yet to truly meet, and nurtured by the unwavering prayers of a faithful community. The miracle, I understood, would not just be for me, but for him. It would be a miracle that spoke to the deepest, most agonizing core of his shattered humanity. A divine intervention that could pierce even the thick armor of a heart hardened by such unbearable grief. The lingering scent of disinfectant from my hospital room, though long since dissipated, seemed to cling to the very fabric of our community, not as a physical odor, but as a subtle, pervasive reminder of the wound we had all sustained. It was an invisible shroud, a memory of sterility and pain that settled over the vibrant life of St. Jude's. The physical scars on my arm and side were mending, fading from angry red to a more muted pink beneath the sleeve of my cassock. They were mere superficial etchings compared to the spiritual laceration across the heart of St. Jude's Parish, a wound far more profound, its healing requiring more than time and antiseptic. I often found myself tracing the faint outline of the scar on my forearm, a silent, almost meditative act, feeling not resentment, but a strange, deep sense of interconnectedness with the one who had inflicted it. From the quiet understanding that had settled upon me in the hushed confines of the hospital, the profound conviction that Arthur Vance's grief was not merely sorrow, but the fertile, albeit tragic, ground for a miracle, I now faced a new, more immediate challenge, shepherding a flock scattered by fear. The immediate aftermath of the attack had been a whirlwind of shocked sympathy and anxious concern. Our rectory, usually a place of quiet contemplation and administrative bustle, had been transformed into a temporary hub of communal solace. Cards, lovingly handwritten with prayers and good wishes, had poured in, their colorful envelopes stacked high on every available surface. Flowers, vibrant and fragrant, had filled every vase, their transient beauty a poignant counterpoint to the raw pain. And casseroles, oh, the casseroles! A testament to the enduring practical love of a community, they warmed my bruised spirit with their homely goodness. These were expressions of love that had wrapped around me like a comforting blanket, a collective embrace from my beloved parishioners. But as the initial shock wore off, as the vivid details of the assault began to recede from immediate memory, and the cold, stark reality of what had happened, a violent assault during the most sacred part of the Mass, began to settle. A palpable unease permeated our beloved church. It was a subtle shift at first, like the imperceptible cooling of a room as night falls, but it was undeniable. The vibrant hum that usually filled the narthex before Sunday services, a symphony of greetings and laughter, the joyous babble of children, the rustle of hymnals, was now replaced by a hushed quiet, almost irreverent stillness that felt more like a suppression of life than a celebration. It was punctuated by nervous whispers, hushed conversations that died abruptly when a stranger entered, and darting glances, eyes scanning not for familiar faces, but perhaps for unseen threats. My heart ached to see it. Mass attendance, once a steady stream of familiar faces, dwindled noticeably. Empty pews, particularly in the front rows where the most devoted often sat, became stark symbols of our collective vulnerability, echoing the hollow ache in my own chest. Each vacant space was a silent sermon in itself, a testament to a faith shaken, not necessarily broken, but certainly bruised. It wasn't that my parishioners had lost their faith. Their presence, however hesitant, was proof of that enduring flicker. Rather, it seemed they had lost their sense of sanctuary. The sacred space, once an inviolable haven of peace and grace, a place where earthly worries could momentarily dissolve in the light of the divine, had been breached, its sanctity profaned by an act of raw human rage. I would watch them enter, a slow procession of worried faces, their shoulders a little more stooped, their eyes holding a flicker of apprehension, scanning the corners, perhaps, for another unseen threat. They came, yes, they still came, but they came with trepidation, and it was a shepherd's most painful duty to witness his flock tremble. To see fear in the very place meant for solace, to feel it linger like an unseen chill even in the warmth of the Holy Spirit, was a constant, gnawing pain. It reminded me with brutal clarity of the wound Arthur Vance had inflicted, not just on my body, but on the communal heart of St. Jude's. The most jarring and indeed alien manifestation of this fear was the silent figure of Mr. Henderson, a kind retired schoolteacher with a gentle demeanor, and hands more accustomed to tending roses than standing watch, now standing sentinel by the heavy oak doors of St. Jude's. His silver hair, usually a beacon of serene wisdom, seemed to carry a new gravity as he stood, stoic and unblinking, eyes quietly assessing each person who entered. His presence, though meant to reassure, only underscored the depth of our wounded security. A church, in its very essence, is an open house, a welcoming embrace, its doors, metaphorical and literal, meant to be open to all, the sinner and the saint, the seeker and the lost, the hopeful and the despairing. To introduce a guard, however benign, felt like drawing a line, erecting a barrier between God's house and his people, a concession to the darkness that had tried to claim dominion. It felt like a subtle surrender, a whisper of defeat in the very citadel of our faith. Each time I walked past Mr. Henderson, whose usual Sunday morning role involved greeting families with warm smiles and helping the elderly find their seats, a pang of sorrow tightened in my chest. This was not the St. Jude's I knew, nor the one our Lord had intended. This was a St. Jude's that had learned to fear, and that perhaps was the attacker's most insidious victory. The silence around Mr. Henderson was louder than any alarm bell, a testament to the erosion of trust, the profound scar on our sense of peace. My sermons, always a sacred trust, a privilege to share the divine word, now became a delicate dance on a tightrope stretched between acknowledgement and reassurance, between sorrow and hope. I spent hours in my study, the lamplight casting long shadows across my well-worn theological texts, wrestling with each word, each phrase. How does one preach about the boundless love of God when the shadow of human hatred looms so large? How does one speak of peace when violence has so recently shattered it? Not in some distant land, but within our very sanctuary. I knew I could not ignore the raw wound. To pretend it hadn't happened, to skirt around the pain, would be to invalidate their very real fear and distrust, to diminish the suffering that had taken root in our collective soul. Such an act would be an affront to their honesty, a dismissal of their very human struggle. So, I acknowledged it. I spoke of the vulnerability of our human condition, the stark reality of evil in the world, and the shattering impact of loss and anger. I gave voice to their unspoken questions, the ones that hung heavy in the air like an oppressive fog. Why would God allow this? Where was He in that moment of terror? How can we ever feel safe again? I offered no easy answers, for there were none. But alongside this acknowledgement, I had to weave in the unwavering thread of faith, the necessity of forgiveness. This was perhaps the hardest part, for forgiveness in the face of such a direct and personal attack felt counterintuitive, almost an affront to justice, an unearned absolution for an act of pure malice. I could feel their skepticism, their unspoken resistance, a palpable tension in the air as I gently steered the conversation towards this most challenging of Christian virtues. I explained as gently as I could that forgiveness was not about condoning the act, nor was it about erasing the pain, or pretending that what had happened was acceptable. It was not a judgment passed upon the perpetrator, nor a dismissal of the suffering of the victim. No, I told them. Forgiveness was about severing the chains that bind us to bitterness, about choosing to release the venom that would otherwise consume us from within, twisting our spirits and darkening our days. It was an act of profound self-liberation, a radical imitation of Christ on the cross, who, in his dying breath, prayed for those who crucified him, uttering words that have echoed through the ages. Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. It was not a weakness, but the very zenith of spiritual strength, a defiance of evil's power to destroy not just the body, but the soul. To forgive, I would say, my voice steady despite the tremor in my soul, despite the memory of the impact still resonating in my bones, is to refuse to let hatred define us, to refuse to let evil have the final word on our hearts. It is to choose life over death, light over shadow, hope over despair, even when the path is shrouded in darkness. To illustrate this complex tapestry of suffering, anger, and faith, I turned repeatedly to the great figures of our own spiritual lineage, men and women who wrestled with God and His mysterious ways, whose laments and protests are enshrined in the very sacred texts we hold dear. I spoke of Job, the righteous man whose life was inexplicably shattered, stripped bare of all joy and comfort. left with nothing but his own suffering and the well-meaning yet ultimately inadequate counsel of his friends. Job, I reminded them, did not simply lie down and accept his fate with pious resignation. He argued with God. He raged. He demanded answers from the heavens that seemed to have abandoned him. He cursed the day he was born, his voice a torrent of anguish against the perceived injustice of his Maker. His language, at times, bordered on blasphemy, yet his heart, even in its deepest anguish, remained tethered to his Creator, refusing to let go of the one he believed had wronged him. "Consider Job," I would begin, my gaze sweeping across the anxious faces in the pews, trying to meet each pair of eyes with compassion and understanding. He was not an atheist, he was a man of profound, unwavering faith. Yet when his world collapsed, when he lost his children, his wealth, his health, he didn't politely ask God for an explanation. He confronted him. He cried out, "Why did I not perish at birth, come forth from the womb and expire?" Job 3:11. He challenged the divine justice. He questioned God's very nature, demanding to know the reason for his torment. And yet, this furious lashing out, this desperate yearning for understanding, this raw, unfiltered outpouring of grief and anger was itself a form of prayer, a broken, shattered prayer perhaps, a lament torn from the deepest recesses of a wounded soul, but a prayer nonetheless. It was his way of engaging with a God he believed in, a God he felt had wronged him. He didn't walk away. He wrestled. He clung to God, even in his protest. I emphasize that Job's story teaches us that God is big enough to handle our anger, our frustration, our deepest, most agonizing questions. He doesn't demand sterile, polite devotion, a veneer of piety that masks true feelings. He seeks our authentic selves, even when that self is raging against the injustice of the world, bruised and battered by life's inexplicable cruelties. Sometimes, I would propose, my voice dropping to a near whisper, the most profound act of faith is not to pretend we have all the answers, but to dare to bring our shattered questions, our raw pain, and yes, even our anger, before the divine presence, trusting that we will not be utterly consumed, but perhaps eventually understood and healed, trusting that God's love is so vast, so encompassing, that it can hold even our most violent doubts without breaking. Then I would turn to Jeremiah, the weeping prophet, whose laments are etched into the very soul of the Old Testament, a testament to the profound suffering of a man chosen by God. Jeremiah, called by God to deliver an unwelcome message of destruction and exile to his own people, bore the crushing weight of his nation's sins and his own profound suffering. He cried out, "Why did I come forth from the womb to see misery and sorrow and spend my days in shame?" Jeremiah 20:18. He felt abandoned, deceived, and overwhelmed by the burden of his prophetic office, yearning for release from a task he found unbearable. His sorrow was not a quiet, resigned grief, but a visceral, heart-wrenching lament, a full-throated cry of despair directed squarely at God, a protest against the very calling that consumed him. Jeremiah's lamentations, I would explain, allowing the heavy weight of his words to fill the quiet church, are a testament to the fact that even the most devoted servant of God can feel utterly forsaken, can question the very wisdom and justice of the Almighty. His despair was so profound, so personal, so exquisitely painful, that it feels almost blasphemous in its raw honesty. Yet, his prophetic voice, his enduring presence in Scripture, tells us that God not only heard his cries, but preserved them for all generations. This, my dear friends, is because God does not ask us to suppress our pain, to mask our despair with false piety, to pretend that we are stronger than we are. He asks us to bring it, unfiltered, to him. For even in that anguished protest, there is an underlying acknowledgement of his existence, a desperate, if broken, reaching out for meaning in a world that feels meaningless. The truth, I concluded, was that Arthur Vance, in his unholy rage and violent act, was also, in his own profoundly misguided and destructive way, performing a broken kind of prayer. He was not a man indifferent to God. He was a man locked in a furious, agonizing argument with a God he desperately wanted to blame for his unspeakable loss, for the gaping wound left by Elena's sudden departure. His attack, while abhorrent and violent, was not born of apathy, but of a profound, consuming pain that sought an ultimate target, a tangible entity to hold responsible for his shattered world. He had sought reason, logic, philosophical comfort, and found only the cold, unyielding silence of the void, a universe that seemed cruelly indifferent to his suffering. And so, he lashed out, not at an indifferent universe, but at the very source of faith and hope that his wife had embraced with such simple joy, and that he himself perhaps had once secretly yearned for even as his intellect rejected it. This was the core message I tried to impart, a message that spoke to the deepest, most agonizing core of his shattered humanity, and perhaps allowed my parishioners to begin to understand, not condone, the unfathomable rage of the man who had attacked their priest. It was an attempt to humanize the monster, not to excuse his monstrosity, but to reveal the profound suffering that had birthed it, to uncover the lost soul beneath the layers of fury. Privately, amidst the quiet of my rectory, my own prayers took on a singular focus. Every morning, kneeling before the tabernacle in the quiet solitude of our small chapel, the flickering sanctuary lamp casting a warm glow on the polished wood. And every night, as the last light faded from my study window, painting the sky in hues of deep violet and gray, I would pray for Arthur Vance by name. I did not pray for his punishment, though that would have been a natural human inclination after what he had done, after the fear and pain he had inflicted. No, I prayed for something far more challenging, far more radical. I prayed for his heart. I prayed that the Lord would not punish him for his terrible act, but rather that he would show me a way, any way, to reach the man buried beneath all that pain, beneath the layers of intellectual pride and raw, unchanneled grief that had calcified around his soul. I pictured him in his cold, desolate cell, alone with his torment, haunted by the specter of his lost love, the memories of Elena perhaps more agonizing than comforting in his godless world. I prayed for a softening of his resolve, for a crack in the formidable self-constructed wall of his atheism, not for the sake of triumph or vindication, but for the sake of his soul's peace, for the possibility of a balm for his profound anguish. I asked God to bypass his intellect, to go directly to the wounded core of his being, to the place where Elena's memory still resided, sacred and agonizing, to the place where love still had a chance to bloom from the ashes of sorrow. My prayers were not eloquent or formal. They were the raw, heartfelt pleas of a shepherd for a lost lamb, however vicious that lamb had become in its desperation. Lord, I would whisper into the silence, the words barely audible, show him your mercy. Let him feel just for a moment the love that Elena knew, the peace she found in you. Let him feel not condemnation for his acts, but your profound, limitless compassion. He is lost, Lord, truly lost, adrift in a sea of grief and anger. Guide him back, even if it is through the darkest valley, even if it means piercing the very darkness he has embraced. I held on to the conviction that no heart, no matter how hardened by sorrow or anger, no matter how insulated by intellectual dogma, was beyond the reach of divine grace. The seeds of an impossible reconciliation, a profound spiritual journey from rage to repentance, were indeed sown in that quiet hospital room, watered by the tears of a broken man I had yet to truly meet, and nurtured by the unwavering prayers of a faithful community, however fearful they might be. The miracle, I understood with a certainty that transcended logic, would not just be for me, the injured priest, but for him, the attacker. It would be a miracle that spoke to the deepest, most agonizing core of his shattered humanity, a divine intervention that could pierce even the thick armor of a heart hardened by such unbearable grief, reaching out to the man Arthur Vance once was, and the man God still knew he could be, a man capable of tending roses and knowing peace. I carried this prayer for Arthur like a constant companion, a heavy yet hopeful burden, trusting in a divine plan that stretched beyond my limited understanding, beyond the fear that still lingered in the sacred corners of St. Jude's. The day of Arthur Vance's preliminary hearing arrived cloaked in a gray, persistent drizzle, matching the solemn mood that had settled over our town. I remember the air in the sacristy that morning feeling particularly thin, as if the very breath of God had momentarily withdrawn, leaving only the scent of old incense and the quiet hum of the heating system. My parishioners, those brave souls who still gathered at St. Jude's, offered me hesitant, concerned smiles after morning mass, their eyes holding a mixture of apprehension for what lay ahead and a fervent, unspoken prayer for my safety. They knew where I was going, what I felt compelled to do. They knew, too, the unspoken dangers of confronting such raw, unbridled pain. I spent a long hour in the quiet of my rectory study before leaving, the well-worn leather of my armchair creaking beneath me as I leaned back, closing my eyes. I wasn't preparing a sermon. I was preparing my heart. I prayed not for eloquence, but for clarity, not for triumph, but for understanding. I prayed for Arthur, for his ravaged soul, for the broken man I had yet to truly meet, and nurtured by the unwavering prayers of a faithful community, however fearful they might be. The miracle, I understood with a certainty that transcended logic, would not just be for me, the injured priest, but for him, the attacker. It would be a miracle that spoke to the deepest, most agonizing core of his shattered humanity, a divine intervention that could pierce even the thick armor of a heart hardened by such unbearable grief, reaching out to the man Arthur Vance once was, and the man God still knew he could be, a man capable of tending roses and knowing peace. I carried this prayer for Arthur like a constant companion, a heavy yet hopeful burden, trusting in a divine plan that stretched beyond my limited understanding, beyond the fear that still lingered in the sacred corners of St. Jude's. The drive to the county jail was a short one, yet it felt like a journey across a vast interior landscape. Each turn of the wheel brought me closer to the man who had sought to extinguish my light, and with it, the light of my faith, at the very altar of God. My chest felt tight, a physical manifestation of the spiritual battle I knew awaited me. I wasn't going to debate him or condemn him. I was going as a shepherd to a lost sheep, albeit one who had violently struck out at his shepherd. My purpose was singular, to offer the grace of Christ even if it was rejected, even if it seemed absurd. The jail itself was a brutalist monument to consequence, a stark contrast to the welcoming warmth of St. Jude's. Gray concrete, sharp angles, and an air thick with the metallic tang of institutional cleaning products, and something else, something akin to despair, clung to everything. The process of entry was disorienting, a series of locked doors, buzzing intercoms, and grim-faced guards. My clerical collar, usually a beacon of welcome, here seemed to draw a different kind of attention, a wary suspicion. I felt observed, categorized, stripped of the usual dignity of my calling, reduced to simply the victim. Finally, I was ushered into a small, sterile visitation room. It was stark, utilitarian, a scratched plastic table, 2 bolted-down chairs, and a thick pane of plexiglass bisecting the space, separating one world from another. There was a small grated speaker for communication. I sat on my side, my hands resting on the cold, unyielding surface of the table, and waited. And then he appeared. Arthur Vance. The man who stepped into the adjacent cell was almost unrecognizable from the enraged phantom I remembered from the altar. The fire was still in his eyes, yes, but it burned in a hollowed-out face, gaunt and etched with the cruel lines of sleepless nights and unrelenting grief. His once sharp academic features were softened by a layer of exhaustion, his skin pale, almost translucent. His hair, once meticulously kept, was now disheveled, falling across his forehead. He wore a standard-issue jumpsuit, faded blue, that hung loosely on his frame, emphasizing his diminished physicality. But it was his eyes that truly arrested me. They were not merely angry. They were desolate, the windows to a soul in profound torment, burning with a cold intellectual fury that had apparently consumed everything else. He was a man drowning in an argument with a God he claimed not to believe in, yet to whom he spoke with such venomous passion. He stared at me, his gaze sweeping over my collar, a sneer twisting his lips. He sat heavily on the chair opposite, making no attempt to meet my eyes directly, instead focusing his contempt on my priestly garb. He picked up the receiver on his side, and I did the same. The static crackle was the only sound for a long moment, a prelude to the storm. "Well, well, Father," he began, his voice raspy, a low growl that barely registered through the speaker. "Come to gloat? To remind me of your supposedly benevolent deity, whose hand guides justice to the righteous?" His words dripped with sarcasm, each syllable a calculated affront. "Or perhaps to deliver some of your empty platitudes. God works in mysterious ways, perhaps." It was his plan? He laughed, a short, sharp bark that held no humor, only bitter scorn. "Tell me, Father, was it God's plan for my Elena to die? Was it God's plan for me to be driven to this act of what you call blasphemy?" I remained silent, my grip tightening slightly on the receiver. I had anticipated anger, but the sheer vitriol, the raw exposure of his brokenness, was more intense than I had imagined. He wanted a reaction, an argument, a theological sparring partner against whom he could vent his unanswerable questions. But I would not give him that. I simply listened, my gaze steady, compassionate, unwavering. It was perhaps the hardest thing I have ever had to do, to absorb such hatred without defense, without argument, to simply be present. "You speak of divine love, Father," he continued, leaning forward, his eyes finally locking onto mine, burning holes in the plexiglass. "Where was your divine love when Elena was gasping her last breath, her beautiful mind collapsing in on itself? Where was your impotent God then? Was he too busy orchestrating the flight of a bird, or perhaps designing a particularly lovely sunset, to bother with the suffering of a good woman, a woman who actually believed in him?" His words were like daggers, each one aimed at the very core of my faith. Yet paradoxically they strengthened my resolve. I saw not an atheist intellectual dispassionately arguing a point, but a man in unimaginable pain, lashing out at the only perceived target big enough to bear the weight of his cosmic despair. His atheism was not a settled conviction, but a shield, a defiant roar against a universe that had robbed him. He recounted in excruciating detail his reasoning for the attack, his voice gaining a chilling, detached quality as he described his premeditated act. "I had watched you, Father. I had seen her, your flock, cling to your words, to your rituals, as if they offered some real solace. It infuriated me. It was a delusion, a lie, And you, Father, were the embodiment of that lie. I hoped, that if I shattered the symbol, if I broke the priest at the altar, during your most sacred, most absurd ritual, that perhaps others would see, perhaps they would awaken to the truth of a universe devoid of meaning, devoid of a caring God. I wanted to make you a martyr, Father, not for your meaningless cause, but as a monument to its futility, a testament to the emptiness of faith. He watched me, his expression a mixture of challenge and morbid curiosity, waiting for me to recoil, to condemn him, to engage in the theological battle he craved. But I did not. I kept my gaze soft, my posture open. My heart ached for him, for the depths of his despair that could lead a man to such a desperate, violent act. I saw not an enemy but a soul in agony, trapped in a self-made prison of grief and intellectual pride. My role here was not to win an argument, but to offer a lifeline. When he finally fell silent, his chest heaving slightly from the intensity of his confession, the air in the small room felt heavy, charged with his unleashed pain. He stared at me, expecting, I don't know what, retribution, a lecture, but I offered neither. I took a slow, deliberate breath, and then, my voice gentle, steady, and filled with a compassion that surprised even myself, I spoke into the receiver. Arthur, I said, using his name for the first time, allowing it to carry the weight of my understanding. I want you to know that I forgive you. The effect was instantaneous and profound, though not in the way one might hope. He stiffened, his eyes widening slightly in disbelief, then narrowing again, as if searching for a hidden trap, a veiled accusation. Then, a sound erupted from him, a raw, ugly, guttural laugh that was devoid of mirth, a desperate, hollow sound that echoed off the barren walls. Forgive me? He sneered, shaking his head. Forgive me for what? For exposing your charade? For nearly sending you to your heaven? What hubris, Father! I don't need your forgiveness. I don't believe in your sins, and I certainly don't believe in your absolution. Save your forgiveness for those who actually believe they need it. He spat the words out, his face contorted in disgust. He seemed to believe my offer of forgiveness was another one of my platitudes, another empty gesture from a system he reviled. He wanted me to be angry, to confirm his worldview of a judgmental, unforgiving God and his equally judgmental servants. My forgiveness, paradoxically, seemed to fuel his rage even further, because it didn't fit into his carefully constructed narrative of a cruel and indifferent universe. Our time was drawing to a close. A guard had already appeared at the door, signaling the end of the visit. I knew there was nothing more I could say, no argument I could win, no intellectual barrier I could breach. His heart, for now, was hermetically sealed against any overt manifestation of faith. But I had one more thing to do, one more seed to plant. I placed the receiver back in its cradle and stood. As I turned to leave, I caught the eye of the guard. Excuse me, I said, keeping my voice low. There's something I'd like you to give, Mr. Vance. I reached into the breast pocket of my cassock and withdrew a small, simple object. It was the wooden rosary the police chief, Dave, had given me, the one they had found on Arthur's desk, buried beneath his atheist literature, Elena's rosary. It felt surprisingly warm in my palm. The guard, a burly man with kind, weary eyes, looked at the rosary, then at me, then at Arthur, who was now pointedly looking away, staring at the gray concrete floor. A rosary, Father? He asked, his voice hesitant, as if unsure of protocol. Yes, I confirmed, pushing it gently through the small slot in the glass, away from Arthur's sightline. It belonged to his wife. Please just give it to him. Tell him it's from me. The guard took the rosary, his fingers brushing mine briefly. He nodded, a flicker of understanding in his eyes. He didn't question me further, sensing perhaps the deeper significance of the gesture. As I turned to leave the room, my hand on the cold steel of the door handle, I paused. I looked back at Arthur, who still refused to meet my gaze. I knew he was listening even if he pretended not to be. And so, with every ounce of faith and compassion I possessed, I spoke one last sentence, not through the speaker, but directly into the sterile air of that grim room, a whisper of hope against the clamor of his despair. God's love is patient, Arthur, I said, my voice carrying softly, clearly. It will wait for you. I did not wait for a response, knowing there would be none, or only a scoff. I simply opened the door and walked out, leaving him to the silence of his cell, and to the small wooden rosary that the guard I trusted would soon place into his care. I left a part of my heart there too, a silent prayer echoing in the emptiness, a fervent plea for a miracle I could only envision but could not yet comprehend. The journey back to St. Jude's felt even longer, imbued with the heavy weight of sorrow, but also with an unwavering, almost audacious hope. I knew that the seed had been planted, however deep in the barren soil of his grief, and God, I trusted, would tend to it in his own mysterious way. I left a part of my heart there too, a silent prayer echoing in the emptiness, a fervent plea for a miracle I could only envision, but could not yet comprehend. The journey back to St. Jude's felt even longer, imbued with the heavy weight of sorrow, but also with an unwavering, almost audacious hope. I knew that the seed had been planted, however deep in the barren soil of his grief, and God, I trusted, would tend to it in his own mysterious way. What happened next, I would only learn later, pieced together from Arthur's own halting, awestruck words and the bewildered accounts of the jail staff. But I can tell you now, with the certainty of a priest who has witnessed the inexplicable unfolding of divine grace, that the miracle did not happen in a sun-drenched cathedral, amidst the sacred oils and hushed reverence of a prepared ceremony. No, it unfolded in the raw, cold, concrete solitude of a county jail cell, in the deepest, most desolate hours of the night. Days blurred into an indistinguishable cycle of despair for Arthur Vance. The sterile uniformity of his surroundings offered no solace, only a mirroring of the emotional wasteland within him. Each night, as the harsh prison lights dimmed and the metallic clang of distant doors echoed through the silent corridors, his carefully constructed intellectual defenses crumbled. The nights were a gauntlet of torment, a relentless replay of the last year of his life. He saw Elena not as she was in life, vibrant and loving, but as she had been in her final moments. The sudden searing pain in her head, the terror in her eyes as life drained away, the frantic, futile dash to the hospital. He felt the crushing weight of her absence, the hollow echo of her laughter, the cold, empty side of the bed. And with each memory, the venom of his rage, so meticulously cultivated against a God he denied, surged anew, burning him from the inside out. He would wake in a cold sweat, gasping, the phantom cries of his wife's final breath still ringing in his ears, his body trembling with an anger so profound it bordered on madness. It was in one such night, perhaps the darkest of them all, that the breaking point arrived. The warden's initial visit to his cell, the simple wooden rosary placed on his small steel slab desk, had only stoked his fury. He'd scoffed at it then, a symbol of everything he despised, everything he blamed for his irreparable loss. He'd even considered throwing it away, but some strange, almost superstitious reluctance had held him back. Now, however, as the phantom chill of Elena's dying grasp seemed to tighten around his heart, and the inferno of his grief threatened to consume him whole, he saw the rosary again. It lay there innocently, pathetically, a testament to a faith he considered a cruel delusion. A guttural growl rose from his chest. With a sudden, desperate surge of rage, he lunged for it. He would shatter it, obliterate this meaningless string of beads, just as his life had been shattered. He would smash it against the unyielding concrete wall, a small, futile act of defiance against the universe that had stolen his love. His fingers, trembling with a year's worth of unspent fury, closed around the simple, smooth wooden beads. And then, it happened. The instant his skin made contact with the rosary, a shockwave, not of pain, but of something utterly, impossibly different, surged through him. The rage that had been a roaring fire in his chest, the bitterness that had been a frozen block in his soul, the despair that had been a suffocating shroud, all of it, in that single eternal moment, simply ceased. It wasn't a gradual fading, it was an extinguishing as absolute and sudden as a candle flame snuffed out by an invisible hand. From the rosary, clutched tight in his hand, a soft, warm light began to emanate. It wasn't blinding, not harsh like the fluorescent glare of the prison, but luminous, gentle, the color of dawn breaking over a misty field. It spread slowly, patiently, casting a golden hue upon the grimy walls, softening the harsh angles of his cot and the stark outline of the toilet. The sterile metallic scent of the jail, the stale air thick with forgotten despair, was instantly, impossibly, obliterated. In its place, the cell filled with an overwhelming, intoxicating fragrance. It was the scent of fresh roses, not a faint whisper, but a powerful, pervasive aroma, as if he were suddenly submerged in a field of the most fragrant blooms, their petals heavy with morning dew. Arthur stood frozen, his breath catching in his throat, the rosary still clasped in his hand, the light growing stronger, the scent deepening, enveloping him. His mind, so accustomed to analysis, to logical deconstruction, floundered. This defied every law of physics, every rational explanation he had ever held dear, yet it was undeniably real. The light pulsed with a living warmth, the scent carried an indescribable sweetness, and within him the impossible transformation continued. A profound peace, unlike anything he had ever known, washed over him. It was a peace that penetrated deeper than his mind, deeper than his emotions, reaching into the very core of his being. It was a love so complete, so unconditional, so immense, that it defied all logic, all reason, all human comprehension. It was a love that knew every scar on his soul, every wound, every hidden fear, and it embraced them all, not with judgment, but with tender, infinite compassion. It extinguished the last embers of his year-long rage, leaving behind not emptiness, but a vast, quiet space filled with solace. He did not see a vision, not a distinct form or face. There were no audible words, no booming pronouncements from above. But he felt a presence as tangible as the light, as real as the scent of roses. It was a gentle, maternal love, a silent, all-encompassing embrace that understood his pain, knew the depths of his grief, and answered it not with theological arguments or philosophical debates, but with pure, unadulterated grace. It was the love of a mother, watching over her suffering child, comforting him not with explanations, but with her very presence. It was the Blessed Mother, I now know with unwavering certainty, extending her hand across the chasm of his disbelief, reaching into the deepest prison of his sorrow. Arthur fell to his knees, not from despair, but from the sudden, overwhelming weight of this grace. The light pulsed, the roses bloomed invisibly around him, and in that cold, hard cell, a heart that had been calcified by anger and intellectual pride was suddenly, miraculously softened, laid bare, and made ready to receive. All the arguments, all the carefully constructed walls collapsed into dust, leaving only awe and a trembling, nascent flicker of faith. He wept then, not with the bitter tears of grief, but with a torrent of tears that cleansed, that healed, that acknowledged, for the first time in a year, the profound and loving presence of the divine. He wept for Elena, yes, but also for himself, for the lost year, for the anger that had blinded him. And as he wept, he felt, for the very first time since her passing, that Elena was not truly gone, but was now held in the same boundless, maternal love that now enveloped him. This was the miracle, stark and undeniable. It bypassed reason, shattered cynicism, and spoke directly to the heart in a language older than words. It was the intervention of heaven in the most desolate of earthly places, a testament to the truth that no soul is ever truly beyond the reach of God's tender mercy. And it was only the beginning. The first insistent trill of the telephone, jarring in the pre-dawn stillness of my rectory, pulled me from a sleep that had been unusually restless. I often found myself waking before the sun, drawn by an inner clock set to the rhythms of prayer. But this morning, the unease in my soul had been palpable, a quiet echo of the tempest that had raged in Arthur Vance's cell only hours before. I lifted the receiver, my voice a little rough with sleep. "Father Michael here." On the other end, the warden, a gruff but fair man named Thomas, spoke, his usual steady tone replaced by a tremor I had never heard. "Father, you have to come. It's Arthur Vance. Something has happened." His words, clipped and urgent, sent a shiver down my spine that had nothing to do with the chill of the morning. Happened? Is he injured? Did he harm himself? My mind, ever prone to the darkest possibilities when dealing with such raw human pain, immediately went there. "No, Father, no, he's different. And, well, there's a smell. An impossible smell. Just come, please. He's asking for you." I dressed quickly, my cassock a familiar comfort in the uncertain light of the nascent day. The drive to the county jail, usually a short, uneventful journey, felt protracted, each street lamp casting long, fleeting shadows that danced with my own racing thoughts. An impossible smell? The warden's words echoed. Could it be? Could the whispers of divine intervention, so often dismissed as fantasy by a cynical world, truly manifest in such a stark, undeniable way, even in a place as desolate as a prison cell? My heart, already attuned to the subtle movements of grace, quickened with a mixture of apprehension and an almost unbearable hope. When I arrived, the jail was hushed, the fluorescent lights of the corridor casting a cold, blue-white glow on the concrete. Warden Thomas met me, his face pale, his eyes wide with a bewildered awe. "Father," he whispered, "I've never seen anything like it. And the roses, it's fainter now. But it was overwhelming a few hours ago." He led me to the visitation room, the same sterile box of thick glass and institutional gray where Arthur had previously hurled his bitter contempt at me. But the man I saw now was not the same. Arthur Vance, the gaunt, hate-filled intellectual whose eyes had burned with the desolate rage of a broken world, was on his knees. He knelt on the cold linoleum floor, not in defiant protest, but in profound, silent supplication. His head was bowed, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. The fierce, cold fire that had once consumed his gaze was gone, replaced by a clarity, a luminosity that seemed to emanate from within. The raw, ugly lines of despair that had etched themselves around his mouth and eyes had softened, replaced by an expression of an ancient, weary sorrow finally given permission to rest. And then I smelled it, faintly now, as the warden had said, but undeniably present. the delicate, intoxicating perfume of fresh roses. It cut through the stale air of the jail. A fragrance utterly out of place, utterly miraculous. It was not the artificial scent of air freshener, but the living, breathing essence of a blooming garden, a whisper of spring in the dead of a spiritual winter. I approached the thick glass, my own heart a vessel overflowing with awe. Arthur slowly raised his head. His eyes, once so clouded with pain and intellectual disdain, were now clear, glistening with tears that were not bitter, but cleansing. They held a vulnerability, a childlike humility I never thought I would witness in him. He pushed himself up, his movements stiff, as if his body was still recalibrating to the profound shift within his soul. He approached the glass, not with a sneer, but with a gaze that pleaded for understanding, for mercy, and then, his voice hoarse, broken by the tears that still fell, but imbued with a quiet, stunning humility. He spoke the words I had prayed for, the words that shattered the impossible contradiction of his presence before me. "Father," he whispered, his eyes fixed on mine, "I believe. I don't understand it, but I believe. Please, can you hear my confession?" The air crackled with the weight of that question, heavy with grace. There, in that cold, sterile visitation room, under the indifferent gaze of surveillance cameras, the man who had tried to murder me confessed his sins. He spoke of his overwhelming pride, the intellectual arrogance that had walled him off from the world and from God. He spoke of the crushing despair that had followed Elena's death, a despair so profound it had mutated into a terrible, all-consuming anger. Anger at God, at the church, at anyone who dared to find meaning in suffering. He confessed his blasphemy, his violence, and the year-long void of bitterness that had masked a grief too deep, too terrifying to touch. As he spoke, the scent of roses seemed to swell, enveloping us in a fragrant, tangible embrace. I listened, my heart aching with compassion, overwhelmed by the raw honesty of a soul laid bare, stripped of all its defenses by the irresistible force of divine love. It was a confession not just of actions, but of a broken spirit, a lost sheep finally found. He didn't just list his wrongs. He revealed the chasm of his sorrow, the depth of his spiritual desolation. He spoke of Elena, not with the old anger, but with a tender, aching love, acknowledging the profound and loving presence he had felt that night, the maternal comfort that had filled his cell. When he finished, a profound silence settled between us, punctuated only by the distant hum of the jail and the soft sound of his breathing. My own eyes were wet. I placed my hands on the cool, unforgiving surface of the thick security glass, aligning my palms with his. And through the grace of God, through the boundless, triumphant mercy that had so clearly descended upon this man, I pronounced the words of absolution. I absolve you from your sins in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. The words, ancient and eternally new, hung in the air, a spiritual balm poured over wounds that had festered for a year. The impossible contradiction was resolved. Divine mercy had triumphed over human rage, over intellectual pride, over the very gates of despair. In that moment, Arthur Vance was not just forgiven, he was reborn. The cold, sterile room seemed to glow with an inner light, warmed by the impossible scent of roses and the palpable presence of a love that transcends all understanding. It was a testament, not to my power, but to the limitless power of God, who pursues even the most hardened hearts, calling them home with a love that can bloom in the most unexpected and desolate of places. Arthur Vance served his time, his sentence remarkably lightened by my own testimony, and more profoundly by the undeniable transformation that had bloomed within him. The prosecutor, a stern woman of the law, admitted she had never seen such a profound change, attributing it to a spiritual awakening she couldn't quite explain. When the day of his release finally came, a quiet autumn afternoon, he did not vanish into anonymity as many ex-convicts do. Instead, he returned to St. Jude's. He never spoke of the miracle in public, not in the direct, declarative way some might expect. Perhaps he felt it was too sacred, too intimate a revelation for casual discourse. But he didn't have to. His very presence amongst us, the way he carried himself, the quiet reverence in his eyes, was its own powerful testament. The man who had once raged against God at our altar now knelt humbly in our pews, a living sermon preached not with words but with a transformed heart. He asked for only one thing: to be allowed to care for the parish grounds, especially the vibrant rose bushes that grew so profusely near the statue of our Blessed Mother. It was a request imbued with profound symbolism, a silent act of penance and devotion. And so, it came to pass. Now, before every Mass, as I vest in the sacristy, I often glance out the window. And there he is, Arthur, no longer the gaunt, furious man consumed by despair, but a figure of quiet grace, kneeling in the rich earth. His hands, once clenched around a weapon, now gently tend the blossoms, pruning, watering, coaxing beauty from the soil. He moves with a quiet devotion that preaches a more powerful sermon than I ever could from the pulpit. He is a living reminder that there is no heart so hardened, no grief so profound, that God's grace cannot penetrate it, cannot soften it, cannot ultimately transform it. His story reminds us all that sometimes the most undeniable proof of His boundless love comes to us, impossibly, in the overwhelming fragrant scent of roses in a sterile prison cell, a divine whisper calling a broken soul home.